Welcome to this crash course of React in 2022. My name is Awais Mirza and I'll be your instructor for this course. This course will teach you everything you need to know for React to start building React-based applications. It's targeted toward beginners. We will talk about components in React, event handling, state management, and also talk about some ecosystem of React. So this is a complete guide for the latest version of React, which is at the time of this recording is 17.0.2. Also check out the description of this video. I've pasted timestamp for this whole video, which will help you to navigate easily. Check out some of the links related to great resources of React. Some of them are my favorite books that I've read personally. And if you have any React development work, you can contact me on my email as well. So without further ado, let's get started with React. Before we start this course, I want to give you a couple of tips. First tip is feel free to use YouTube speed options to increase the speed or decrease the speed. I usually find myself to speak a bit slow, so some people might benefit for making me speak faster by using a YouTube speed options. Second tip I have for you is to not just watch this video, but open up your favorite text editor and try to write code with me. This is going to help you understand React better. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started with React.js and try to become a React.js developer in few hours. Okay, so we are going to start by looking at official documentation, and the URL for React.js is this, reactjs.org. And here we click on docs. Looking at official documentation is the best place to explore more about the framework. I'm going to find out how do we create a new React app using official documentation. This way will give you an idea how to learn new technologies or learn React. Obviously, I'm going to teach you React in this video, but I'm also going to teach you how to go and explore more about React using official documentation. And this is the main part that is missing on most of the YouTube videos about React. They teach you on a text editor, but they don't teach you how to explore more. So this is very, very important to learn how to go and explore more. So we're going to take a look at official documentation and I'll try to explain concept in an easy way. Okay, so first of all, we're going to find out how do we create a new React app. In the getting started guide, if you go down here, we have a section for create new React app. I'm going to click on learn how. And on this page, if you go down, here's a CLI for that. So I expect you to know JavaScript already and some sort of a CLI experience. CLI is command line application, which basically help us to create a new React app. It says Node version 14 and NPM version 5.6 or above. So I'll take you to VS Code, and this is a text editor we're going to be using throughout this course. As a quick reminder, if you need any React development, maybe you want to build your website or build a mobile application using React Native, you can contact me via email. So email will be given in the description and you can see on the screen as well. Command to create a React application is going to be npx create React app and then the name of the app. In this case, I'm going to use React tutorial. You can also use template, which is going to be TypeScript. You need 2 lashes here. And this is going to set up your project with TypeScript. And we don't want that for now. I'm going to press enter and it's going to create a new project. It's going to install the dependencies like React, React DOM, React scripts, and CRA template. So wait for this to complete, then we will open this folder in VS Code. So the project is created. You can type command code / the name of your application, which is basically a folder. Press enter. It's going to open that folder in VS Code. We got some folders in our project like source, public. We got some files like package.json. If you ever worked with any other framework or library using NPM, package.json is always there because it keeps a record of dependencies, scripts, and some configuration for your project. In terms of dependencies, we have some testing libraries. We got React, we have React DOM, React Script, Web Vitals. So these are all the dependencies that you get when you create a project using CLI. We got scripts, which we can run to start, build, test, eject. Some configuration for browser list, development, and ESLint configs there as well. Apart from this, we get to see this git ignore file, which already have some common files that we want to ignore from Git. Now let's take a look at this source folder. In the source folder, the entry point for your React application would be index.js. And this is the code that will run when you start your server. Now we're not going to go into details of what are these things right now, but take a look at this is your index.js, which is an entry file for your project. We have index.css, that's a style file for your entry file. App.js, it's a component file. Let's not worry about this, but for now we have app.js, which is a default component created by React CLI, and its style file is there as well. Then we got this app.test.js file, which is used for testing. We got setup test, we got import web vitals. We'll talk about these files in details later. We also have this public folder generated by Create React App. In this folder, we have this file index.html, which is the entry file for all the DOM that will be rendered on your application. One element, which is this one, div id equal to root, is your main parent element. I'm going to take you to index.js file, and here it is selecting document.element by id, which is root, and this is going to be the parent element for all the DOM that will be generated. Now at this stage, we are going to run our application. If you look at package.json file, you have the script, and I can use this start script to run this application. So let's open terminal, and I'm going to type npm run start. Let it build, and then we will have our application running. There we go. So that's the Chrome that is serving our application on localhost 3000. If you look at VS Code, here it says it's running on localhost 3000, and it gives you an IP address if you want to have a look at this on your local network. We use Create React App to create this application, and one problem with that is it is going to create some boilerplate code for us, which we don't need. For example, these three files, we don't need these right now because we haven't got to the point where we understand these files. So I'm going to just remove them, and from index.html, I'm going to remove this as well. Just remove app, and then remove the input for app as well. And here we're going to type h1 hello world. The reason why I'm typing hello world is because hello world is the program that you create whenever you learn a new programming language or new framework. This is the first program that you should be creating. It's fun, and this is where usually people start learning any new technology. I'm going to save the file. Let's go to the app. I'm going to refresh, and you can see now our application is running, but it doesn't have that React logo, and it doesn't have that text. So right now we have a clean start for React application. In the public folder, you don't really need to change anything. You might want to get rid of this file. So these two logos not required anymore. So I'm going to delete those as well. And favicon, here we can leave that there for now. This is basically this little icon here. That's fine for the React tutorial. We're going to leave that there. Okay, it's time for some explanation of this code. If you take a look at index.html, here we have this div element, which has an ID root. So we already know that index.js is the entry point for our application. And within this, we have this React strict mode. We'll talk about this later, but one thing to notice here is we're using document.getElement by ID, and we're accessing root. And once you access root, you are rendering this h1 within a root. So even if you just comment these two lines out, add comma, save the file, we'll take a look at our application. if I refresh, you'll see hello world is still being rendered. So this react.strict mode will explain later, but just notice that if you're using this react DOM.render function on it, and whatever element that you're going to put in, it is going to render into your DOM using this document.getElementById, which is root. So if I go to index.html file, I'll say instead of root, I'll change that to main. I'll save this file, and if you go there, we get an error in our application. We go back to VS Code, and I'm going to change this to main. Save. Let's take a look and refresh, and you see that hello world is being rendered. So it doesn't matter what you have here, it has to match your main root element, which is main right now. We'll change back to root because that's the convention created by Create React app. So I'll just change it back to root. Hello again. Next concept we're going to take a look at is going to be JSX. It's time for us to go to documentation, and here in the main concept it says introducing JSX. I would like you to read these paragraphs. What is JSX and how do you use that? Go on, pause the video and read these first two paragraphs, and then we're going to jump into actually writing some code, and then I'll explain to you what JSX can do for us. If you're ready, let's go and use some JSX. First of all, you see this hello world here. I would like this to be as an element, which I store that in a variable. And instead of typing hello world here, I'm going to target element, add a comma, save the file, and let's take a look at our application. Refresh, and you can see hello world is still being rendered. I'm going to get rid of this React strict mode. I'm going to start by creating a new variable. JSX provides a syntax to add JavaScript expression using curly braces in JSX. So for example, here is a variable. If I want to use the value of name, which is Paul, into this hello world, I can do that by using curly braces and then just type the name of the variable, which is name at this stage. I'm going to save the file and we're going to refresh the page, and now you can see it says hello Paul. Now this is a valid JavaScript expression. You can actually use JavaScript expression like 2 + 2, save the file, and we should see 4 now. It's time for us to go back to documentation and take a look at one more example. So here it says it has a format name function, which returns user the first name, user the last name. I'm actually going to copy this bit instead of me typing in, saving a bit of time is better, and you guys will understand what does it do. So here we got a function name, format name, and then here we have a const object, user, which has two properties, first name and a last name. Then you also have this element now, which basically calls this format name function and passes this object. Now if I just save the file and go here and then refresh the page, it's giving me an error. So how do we see what is an error? It's because the consent is already defined for element, and that's where the problem is. I'm going to remove these two lines now, save the file, go to our application, refresh, and here it says hello Harper Paris. Okay, so if you know JavaScript, you know how to create functions. It's reading a value from user as first name and then last name. Let's say if we change this to, let's say, first name to first nam, which is like a typo mistake. I'll go and refresh. It does not break the application, but gives you an undefined because this value does not exist on the object that you're passing as a parameter in format name function. Let's go to documentation, and I'm going to show you another way to create element. Now you can see that we are using this React DOM object and calling this render function on it. And here we're passing this element. I'm actually going to remove this element, and I'm going to create an H1 element using React. So if you go to documentation, I'm going to show you an API reference for React. We're also going to go to API reference, and here we have this React object. I'm going to open that in a new tab, and here it says React is the entry point to React library. and it provides some function to create elements, like creating an element. I'm going to read this paragraph. It says, we recommend using JSX to describe what your UI look like, and each JSX element is just a syntactic sugar for calling react.createElement. So we go back to VS Code, and I'm gonna just finish this off. First of all, I'm going to specify what element I'm trying to create. In this case, I'm going to create h1, and for the second parameter, I'm going to just pass in null, because input attribute, we don't want to pass anything. And for a child, we'll just pass in text like hello world. Okay, and then add a comma there. I'm going to save the file, and we're going to take a look at our application by refreshing this page. And there you go. So it's now rendering hello world. Here's an API reference for everything available in React library, like React, React DOM. We're going to visit these time to time as well. Now let's go back to main concept and introducing JSX. Let's finish it off by explaining the rest of the JSX concept. The rest of the basics JSX concept we are going to learn from official documentation, because that's where the information is, but I'll just add some explanation on top of it. So it says JSX is an expression too. So what does that mean? When you compile JSX expressions, it becomes a regular JavaScript function calls. So if you take a look at this example here, it is a get greeting function, use if you return h1 hello world, and you call another function wrapped in curly braces. This means that you can use JSX inside of if statements or in for loops, assign to variables and accepts it as an argument and return it from functions. Also specify attributes using JSX, and examples here. Now, we don't have much to talk about these right now. We'll come back when we start our project. So if you go down, it says specifying children with JSX, and you can do that very, very simple. If you understand JavaScript, HTML, CSS, you got a div, you got two h1s within that div, and then you can call that div as an element. Now, one more important thing here is about security. So JSX prevents injection attacks. Explaining injection attacks is out of the scope of this video. So if you want to read about it, click on this link here, XSS cross-site scripting, and you can read about what are injection attacks. You can also represent JSX objects, and we've already seen that. We create an element using this react.createElement. So that's about it for introduction to JSX. Next, we're going to talk about rendering elements. Elements are the smallest building block of a React apps. If you take a look at our code, right now we only have one element, and this is where we are rendering. If you look at the documentation, it also tells you how the elements are being rendered, which I've already explained actually. Here we have this root level do, and we call this as a root DOM node because everything inside it will be managed by React DOM. In terms of our application, we can see we have this root element, which is specified in index.html. We go back to index.js, and here we are accessing it by getElement by ID, and we're passing it root. And that's pretty much it talks about. If you go down, it talks about updating the rendered element. To try this sample code given by official documentation, I'm going to copy this bit, go to VS Code, and I am going to paste that here. Let's comment this out and then paste that here. I'm going to save the file. Let's go back to our application, refresh, and open developer tools. And I'm going to go to div element. Let me just zoom in a bit. And within this div element, we have this h2. As you can see here, in terms of rendering the page, only thing is being updated is this timer. React is not rendering hello world again and again. And this is why React is so fast, because it only regenerates or re-render elements which are required. Going back to VS Code and looking at this code, basically it is creating an element here, and within this h2 it is creating a new date to locale timestamp, And then we are using this set interval tick to 1 second. So it basically, this will call this tick function every second. Takeaway from this example is, even though this tick function is being called every second, within this tick function we have elements, but the only thing is being updated is what's required. So React is pretty smart to see what's required, and it will only update that. Let's go to documentation again, and this is what it talks about. If you want to read about it, you can read it. Now let's go down here. It's showing the same thing that I just shown you. And that's about it. That's where we finish our rendering element basics guide. But obviously we will come to understand more later when we start our project. It is time for us to talk about components and props. Components are one of the main concepts in React, and usually it's a main concept in other frameworks as well, like Angular and Vue. React lets you create components, which helps you to split the UI into independent, reusable pieces, which helps you to organize your code. React provides two types of components: function-based components and class-based components. We'll take a look at both types, but React recommends to use function-based component in modern React, or I would say the latest version of React. So yeah, this is the guide we're going to follow, but at this stage, we will be ready to start our project as some sort of a project, which will give you an idea how to use these components, how to break down your code into smaller components and reuse them. So yeah, this is a very interesting concept. And without further ado, let's get started with components and props. Let's clean up our code. We go back to VS Code, and I'm going to get rid of all the code which we don't need to get started with components. I'm going to uncomment this render DOM.render function, and I'm going to go to application, and here I want to make sure that I render hello world. Let's go to documentation and take a look at what we have in the official documentation. So here are two examples, and this will tell you how to create a function-based component, and it seems pretty simple. Right? It's just a function named welcome, returns h1 tag with props.name. So it takes the parameter props, and .name would be the property on props object, and then it will just return that with hello. Apart from this function base, you can also use the class-based component. So you create a class named welcome. It's the same, it's just a name, whatever you type, doesn't matter. All you gotta do is just extend react.component. So if you look at the API reference, here we have this react.component, and that's what you're going to extend. So this is a class that you're gonna extend. Then we call the render function because this react.component class contains render function, which we can use. And then we return this same hello this .prop.name. And a prop will basically be passing to the constructor function. So if you know JavaScript, we'll basically have this constructor function by default, even though you don't define it. Now these are two types of components that you can create with React. Let's go to VS Code, and I'm gonna go and create a simple function. We're gonna store that into a variable. I'll just say my component. And just to demonstrate this in a simple way, I'm just going to return I am custom component. Okay, and the way you can render this inside our render DOM.render function, you just open this lesson sign and then type my component, and then just close that, add comma, and that's it. So if you go to your application, you will refresh and it says I am custom component, and it's just a string. So if you look at in the root, it is just a string that is being rendered. I'm going to convert this string into, let's say, h1 tag, and we can say hello, and then we can use the props in curly braces .name, and we're going to pass in props to our function. So not this .props, but just a prop variable. And the way you can pass in this object now, if you go to my component where you're rendering it, you just pass in name equal to, and I will say Bob. Save, go to application, gonna refresh, and it says hello Bob. So basically it is going to take this prop object, and then on that property it will look for a name which we're passing here, and then it will just render out. Now if I change this to, let's say, NAM, not name, we'll go back and refresh. Now it's not going to render that because it does not find this property name on props that you're passing in. Very simple. This is how you create a simple function-based component. Now, apart from this, we can also use react.createElement. So if I go at react.createElement, and then in this, I'm going to create h1 and then pass in null for attributes. And then we can just say hello. And I'm going to use this props.name. It's going to automatically read because here IntelliSense is kicked in. So I'm just going to change that to name. And let's get rid of this bit here. Save. Now we go to application, refresh, and now it says hello Bob. So it is actually creating an element using this react.createElement. The type would be this h1, and then it's got two parameters. So it's rendering hello, and then it's reading props.name as well. So if you give a space here, it'll have some space. Okay, so that's like you can create an element within the function component as well. We're going to create a custom class component, and this is the second way to create a component in React. And we do that by defining a class that extends react.component and implements the render function. So what I'll do here is create a class. I'll name it my component. It is going to extend react.component. It implements render method. And this will return, I'm going to just be very simple here. I'm going to say I am class-based component. Save the file, and we're going to get rid of this function-based component. Actually, just comment it out. And then here I'm going to refresh the page. And here it says expected an assignment or a function call, instead saw an expression. Problem is here. So you see this two single quotes, and that's a problem. Just remove that and then refresh. It says I'm a class-based component. Right now, we are not reading this name in our class-based component. I'm actually going to just copy this bit and then paste it here. Instead of just returning the string, I'm going to use this react.createElement. I'm creating h1, and then I'm going to just return this .props.name. I'm going to save the file, and let's refresh. Now it says hello Bob. So as you can see that we are reading the name prop value using class-based component. So we've seen both types of components in React, class-based and function-based. Now you might be wondering which syntax to use. All this option JSX versus pure JavaScript, or class component versus the function one, which one to use? JSX is the most common, and unless you dislike the XML syntax in your JavaScript, the path of least resistance and less of a typing is to go with JSX. This is a question of preference. If you are comfortable with object-oriented programming and you like how classes are laid out, then by all means go for it. Use class-based components. Function-based components are a little lighter on computers' CPU and involves a little less typing. They also feel more native to JavaScript. Actually, classes didn't exist in early versions of JavaScript language. They are an afterthought and merely a syntactical sugar on the top of functions and prototypes. Historically, as far as React is concerned, function components were not able to accomplish everything that classes could until the invention of hooks, that is, which you will get into in due time. As for the future, one can only speculate, but it's likely that React will move more and more towards function components in the future. However, it's highly unlikely that class components are going to be deprecated anytime soon. So in this course, I will teach you both ways, and sometimes we will use function-based components, sometimes we'll use class-based components. It depends on the requirement. Well, there's a lot of code out there. There is a real world written classes and lots of online tutorials. In fact, at the time of this recording, even React's official documentation shows most examples as class components. Therefore, I would like to show you sometimes class-based component and sometimes function-based components. Next, we're going to take a look at default properties. Your component may offer a number of properties, but sometimes a few of the properties may have default values that work well for the most cases. You can specify default properties values using default property for both function and class components. So I'm going to comment this out and uncomment function-based component. I'm going to use this my component dot default property. So, and that's going to take, let's say, job, and we can say software developer. And now I'm going to use comma props dot job. Save the file, and we're going to take a look at our application, and now it says hello Bob software developer. So as you can see, this is basically going to be passed in as a default props. In terms of class base, I'm going to just comment the function base out, and in terms of class base, you can do the same thing. So if I uncomment this, it's going to read my component.default props, and if I refresh the application, it says hello Bob. So have to save and then refresh, still says Bob, does not read out software developer. And the reason for that is because here we have not specified this, let's say this dot props dot job. Okay, let's go and take a look at now. So as you can see, it's now rendering that text. Okay, so welcome to this section of the course in which we are going to talk about state and life cycle of a component. This is a very, very important topic because maintaining state means you're going to maintain the data in your components, and life cycle of a component is very important as well. So this is very, very important concepts that we're going to be learning in this section. I'm really excited. So without further ado, let's get started. All the examples that we've seen so far were pretty static or stateless. The goal was just to give you an idea of building blocks of composing your UI, but where really React shines is when the data in your application changes. React has a concept of state, which is any data that components wants to use to render themselves. When the state changes, React rebuilds the UI in the DOM without you having to do anything. After you build your UI initially in your render method or in the rendering function in case of a function component, all you care is about updating the data. You don't need to worry about UI changes at all. After all, your render method function has already provided the blueprint for which the component should look like. It's time for us to do an exercise. We're going to be building a text area component that keeps count of number character typed into text area. Create this text area counter component using class-based component, and also define a default props for this component. Also, I've added this text area component in our render function from React DOM so we can render this component. Now, if I take a look at application, right now it says count me as a type, but it is not showing us any h3 tag with the length of our text. Now, because we haven't created the state for that, let's go and make this stateful. So we've done the component code, and I'm going to explain now. Now this pattern is going to help us to finish and cover a lot of React in very less time compared to if I start typing and then explain while I type. That is very slow. So I'm just going to follow this pattern where I type the code and then I'll go and mark up on the code and then explain. So the first line that we're going to talk about is this super. Calling super in the constructor is required before you can call this. Okay, this is a keyword. And to be able to use this, you need to call super. Now, within this, we have another function, which is going to update the state on text change. And where we're calling this function is in the text area. And this is just the text area event on change. Every time we change a value within the text area, it's going to fire up this event, which calls this on text change function and pass in the event. And the event has the target property and then the value property, which keeps the value of our, all the text in the text area. Next, we are just rendering out this text.length. So whatever the text length would be, it will just be rendered. And take a look at our application. Right now, as you can see here, we have this count bin, and then we got the length of the text. I'm going to start typing something, and you can see the state is being updated. Okay, so any character that you'll type in, it will just update its length and the state. Because we are targeting the state, the value of this h3 will be updated. I'm going to talk a little bit about this event. React uses its own syntactic event system for performance to help understand why you need to consider how things are done in pure DOM world. A little note on DOM events. Right now we're using onChange on text area. To avoid any confusion, a few clarifications are in order recording the following line. onChange event, and we'll call this function. React uses its own syntactic event system for performance to help understand why you need to consider how things are done in the pure DOM world. We're going to talk about event handling in olden days. It's convenient to use inline event handlers to do things like this. You call it onChange, you could call onClick, all the HTML5 events you could use here. Well, they are convenient and easy to read, but it's inefficient to have too many event listeners scattered like this. It's also hard to have more than one listener on the same line or same HTML tag, especially if said button is in somebody else's component or library, and you don't want to go in there and fix or fork the code. That's why in the DOM world, it's common to use element.addEventListener to set up listener, which now leads to having code in two places or more. And event delegation to address the performance issues. Event delegation means that you listen to events at some parent node, say div, that contains many buttons, and you set up one listener for all the buttons instead of one listener per button. Hence, you delegate the event handling to a parent authority. Enough about pure DOM events. Now, how React handle events. React uses syntactic event to wrap and normalize the browser events, which means no more browser inconsistencies. You can always rely on the fact that event.target is available to you in all browser. That's why in the text area counter snippet, you only need event.target.value, and it just works. It also means the API to cancel events in the same in all browser. In other words, event.stopPropagation and event.preventDefault works even in the old version of Internet Explorer. The syntax makes it very easy to keep the UI and event listeners together. It looks like old school inline event handlers, but behind the scene, it's not. Actually, React uses event delegation for performance reasons. React uses camel case syntax for event handlers, so you can only use onClick instead of onClick. So make sure they are camel case. If you need the original browser event for whatever reason, it's available to you as event.native event, but it's unlikely that you will ever need to go there. And one more thing, The onChange event, as used in the TextAra example, behaves as you would expect. It fires event when the user types, as opposed to after they have finished typing and have navigated from a field. Before we go ahead with React and learn more advanced topics, I would like to take you to Chrome Developer Tools, and I am going to search here for an extension created by Facebook. So if you go to Chrome Web Store and search for React, and then you'll see this React Developer Tools, and please add that to your Chrome browser. Once you've added that extension, you go to this arrows in the developer tools, and you'll see two more options to select: profiler and component. Let's go to component. Here you see there's an error, but I'm going to just click on dismiss. Once you dismiss that, you will see TextAra counter component. I'm going to click on that, and you will see the props, and right now there's no state. So if I just start typing, you'll see the state will appear, and now you can visualize the state of a component. It's got quite a bit of information here, but we'll get to learn this extension step by step. Okay, so this extension is going to help us to visualize our component and their state, and then the props and rendered by, and then the source. So it's pretty nice and pretty compulsory for React development. React offers several so-called lifecycle methods, and you can use the lifecycle methods to listen to changes into your component as far as the DOM manipulation is concerned. The lifecycle of a component goes through 3 steps: mounting, updating, unmounting. The component is added to the DOM initially, that's called mounting. Updating means the component is updated as a result of calling setState method on it, and a prop provided to the component has changed. Unmounting means that the component is removed from the DOM. Now, all that information we take a look at in documentation as well. So in a state and lifecycle, if you go to state and lifecycle in a documentation, this is where it is explained. And you can see 2 methods here: componentDidMount and componentWillUnmount. So I would like you to read through this, but we're going to take a look at a different approach and a different way of explaining this. React does the part of its work before updating the DOM. This is also called a rendering phase. Then it updates the DOM, and this phase is called commit phase. With this background, let's consider some lifecycle methods. To add a method componentDidMount, and we're just logging TextAra counter is mounted. Let's take a look at and refresh the page, and notice here TextAra counter is mounted. That's been logged to the console. This is the place to do any initialization work that requires the DOM. Any initialization work that does not require the DOM should be in the constructor method, and most of your initialization shouldn't require the DOM. But in this method, you can do something like measure the height of a component that was just rendered, add any event listeners, or fetch the data from a server using HTTP. Now, right before the component is removed from the DOM, there's another method called ComponentWillUnmount is called. So let's add that. ComponentWillUnmount, and it's just logging TextAra counter will unmounted. Well, let's just change that to unmount. This is a place to do any cleanup work you need. Any event listeners or anything else that can leak memory should be cleaned up here. Other 2 lifecycle events as well: componentDidUpdate and shouldComponentUpdate. So if I start typing component, IntelliSense will kick in, and you can use this componentDidUpdate. And I'm going to do a log here. I'll just say updated. Let's save, and let's go to the app. I'm going to refresh. I'm going to clear the console, and I'm going to just type. So every time there's a new value in the state, you'll see it is logged. So as you can see, if you want to track something when every time the component gets updated, you can do that here. There's another lifecycle method as well. So if you type component, actually that is should component update. Let's go to application. Let's refresh. Now the should component takes 2 parameters as well: new props and new state. which is an opportunity for an optimization. You're given the state to be, which you can compare with the current state, and then decide not to update the component, in which case its render method is not called. Save. Let's go there and then refresh. I'm going to clear the console and let's start typing. And it says text count me as I type, and then text count me as typed. So you see the existing state and then the new state that we're putting in. Say I want to add a condition. I don't want to have more than 20 characters. So I'll go here and I'm gonna type if new state dot text dot length greater than 20, then return false. Okay, otherwise we can just return true. Now let's go to app, refresh, and I'm gonna type D. You see the value 19 updated, but if I type one more time, and now if I'm typing, it is actually not updating the state, even though you can see the text in the text box, but that doesn't mean the component state is being updated. So you can see if you return false from it, it's not going to update the component state. Next, I would like to take a look at the documentation. Within this state and lifecycle page, here it is mentioned that using state correctly. It's very important. I'm pointing out to the documentation so you get a habit of looking at the documentation as well. So here it says, do not modify the state directly, where you could access the state.comment and change its value, and it's basically saying do not do that. For example, this will not re-render a component, and that's a problem. And instead, what you need to do is use setState method on your component, and then just use the object and target the property that's value you're going to change. And it says the only place where you can assign this.state is in the constructor. This is one very important thing as well. So make sure in the constructor, when the component get initialized, that's where you're going to set the state. Next, we have this state updates may be asynchronous. So what does that mean is React may batch multiple set call into single update for performance. And because of that, the properties for this.prop and this.state, you should not rely on their values for calculating the next state for your component. So here they've given an example saying if you target this.setState, you target counter and then its value, but that's wrong. The correct way to do that is by using this.setState. It's a function, and then you call the inner function with take state and props, and that's where you will do your logic. Now, we use an arrow function above in the documentation, and it also works with the regular function as well. So if you want to specify like ES5 version of JavaScript, you can do that as well. This page, we got a few more concepts like state, updates, or merged. And these are very, very simple. If you're coming from a JavaScript background, you should be able to read these and understand something like how data flows down from component to actual function components. And it's been a while since we have actually seen a function-based component. So what happened to function component? Now you might be wondering, all that concepts we talked about, most of them were from class-based components. So what happened to function components? So you may have noticed that the function components dropped out from this chapter by the time this.state got involved. And they come back later in the course when you will also learn the concept of hooks. Since there are no this in the function, there needs to be another way to approach the management of a state in a component. And the good news is that once you understand the concept of state and props, the function components differences are just syntax. As much fun as it was to spend all this time on a text area, let's move on to something more challenging. In the next section of this video, you will see where React's benefits come into play. namely focusing on your data and having React take care of any of all the UI updates. This course is going to take a little bit of a turn from learning from documentation to actual small project. We're going to be creating a fancy table in the form of component, which will have some data, and we can visualize that into a proper table. So let's get started. Index.js has this code only. I cleaned up the rest of the code. Tables are all about data. So the table component should take an array of data and an array of headers that describes each column. Let's paste the test data, or we can call it mock data. So here's a list or array of headers, and here we got array of data. The first thing, just to get the new component off the ground, is to display only the headers of the table, and the bare bone implementation might look like this. Okay, that's a bare bone implementation. Next, I'm gonna paste some more code, and I'll explain that. So here we're creating an empty array, and then we're looping through that array and grabbing the values from props. And we're just pushing that into the headers array with this th and title. Then we're just returning a table, which is a plain HTML5 table, and then pushing that headers here. So if I save this and go to my component and refresh, we get a bunch of errors. Here says that, okay, not a DOM element. So that's true because we haven't really used the table component yet. So if I do that, save, and still it's not going to render because we haven't passed in the array yet. So we're going to pass in the headers array. So we'll just say headers equal to headers. This line can be very confusing for beginner developers or beginner React developers who haven't worked with any other framework. So I'm going to refer that these headers equal to headers. It is confusing, I understand that, but just to demonstrate that this header array is basically these headers. And these headers is inside the component constructor function that you can specify props, and you can access prop without specifying constructor function. And then the key on that is these headers. So let's say if I take a look at our component, it is being rendered, but let's just say if I try to access instead of headers, just a header, save, and then refresh, and you'll see an error. It says the prop header is not iteratable. So basically this does not exist. That's why we get an error. And we're gonna fix that by using either change these headers to header and save. Let's go take a look at our application, refresh, and you see everything is being rendered perfectly fine again. So remember this. This is your value array basically that you're pushing into, you know, a component, and this is where you are targeting the key within the component. This example worked fine, but let's see how you can accomplish the same with less code. Right now we're using for loop and looping through the headers array, but let's say if I just change this line to this, so what we're doing is this.props.header, and then using a map function, which will map out the values of headers. And then we're just using that as a title, and then basically just returning this th, and then using curly braces to read the value of a title. I'm going to comment out these 4 lines or 3 lines. And if I go and take a look at, you'll see there is an error. It says cannot read the properties of undefined. Why is that? The reason for that is we using headers key on the props, but it actually doesn't exist, so we need to fix that by just specifying headers. Now let's go and refresh, and you'll see everything is being rendered again. It's time to add the body to the table. The data to be rendered is 2-dimensional array, rows and columns, that we have right here. To pass the data to our table component, we use a new prop called initialize data or initial data. Why initial? It's not just data. As touched on briefly in the previous couple of sections of this video, it's about manage expectations. The caller of your table component should be able to pass the data to initialize the table, but later as the table lives on, the data will change because the user is not able to sort, edit, and so on. In other words, the state of a component will change. So let's use this.state.data to keep track of the changes, and use this.prob.initialData to let the color initialize the component. So we're going to go down where we call this component, and I'm going to pass in initial data equal to, and we're going to pass in a data. So at this stage, this is the data array, and that's what we're pushing in. And initial data is just that we're targeting on the state now. Actually, not on the state, but on the props. Let's get rid of these 4 lines, and we're going to use a constructor function outside the render. I'm going to start with constructor, and that's going to take props. We're going to say super, that's required, this.state equal to, and we're going to target data, and we use props.initialData. The data is 2-dimensional, so you need 2 loops, one that goes through the rows and one that goes through the data cells for each row. So this can be accomplished using 2 of the same .map loop you already know. Let me paste the whole code and I'll go and explain that. Here, the first th head, we are creating this using this headers array, and we're mapping through this, and then we're just passing this th key and a value. That's pretty simple, right? And same thing we're doing here, but we have this inner loop as well, which is going to, loop through on the row as well, and then create a cell out of it. So that's pretty self-explanatory if you are coming from a JavaScript background. I'm gonna save this file and go and take a look at it by refreshing. And now you'll notice if we zoom out and then close the developer tools, and you can see that we are basically creating a table using React. Now we're going to talk about handling events using React. If you go to this handling-event.html file in React documentation, you'll get to where you have all the information about events in React. You can go through this documentation, but one of the main difference in React event versus plain HTML5 event is that React events are camel case. So you look at this here, this is on-click event. In React, we have same on-click, but with the camel case, so C is capital for that. Let's go back to the code and quickly take a look at one event. So I'm just going to paste a button here, and I'm going to just call a function logMe. Okay, the function doesn't exist, but let's create that next. So if we go up inside our class component, I'm going to create a function logMe, and this is just going to log to the console. Let's save the file and we go take a look at the page. Let's refresh. It says logMe is not defined. Now the reason why it's not accessing logMe because we need to type this.logMe. So let's go and refresh the page. We go to console, click on logMe, and you can see it is logging to the console. Now what if I change that to on click with lowercase c? Refresh the page, go to console, click on logMe. As you can see, it's no longer working, and that's because our event is not camel case. You can also pass in data to the function using param. So I'll just say x, and then now we are going to print out x into our function. That's pretty simple stuff if you know JavaScript. So I'm pretty sure you know JavaScript. That's why I'm just gonna go through this quickly. So we're just calling this logMe, and then we can pass in the data as well. So I'll just say log to the console from param. Let's take a look at in our application. Now if I refresh the page, go to console, I click on logMe, but it doesn't print out anymore. So what's going on? It's just a one-time print. Problem is that when we pass any parameter to our function, it has to bind to this class. So the way we can do that is by using this dot bind function, and within that we are going to type this comma. And if I save the file now And let's go and click on log me now. You will see after refreshing the page, I can keep clicking on it and then it will just rerun that function. Second way of handling this is calling our log me function within an arrow function. So I'm just going to paste that code here. And now you can see we call this log me and wrap inside our arrow function syntax. If I refresh the page, I click on log me and you can see it is calling our function. Now we can always refer to documentation, and here's the documentation for that. Now we're going to talk about conditional rendering in React. So conditionals are very common in any programming language like if and else statements, and you can do the same in React as well. So if you look at this, it says conditional rendering in React works the same way as work in JavaScript. You can use JavaScript if operator or conditional operators to create elements representing the current state. Let's demonstrate this in code. So here we got this table component. I'm going to paste some code here. It's another component. Let's zoom in a bit. Okay, so it's a render to condition component. It has an variable element, and we just have an if else statement. So if true, then it will return the table inside the div. If it's false, then it will return the div with no components to render. So for example, if I use this component, so we just say render to condition, add a comma there, save, and let's take a look at our applications. Refresh, and you can see it is working. Now if I go ahead and make this false, save, and let's refresh again. Now it says no component to render. So as you can see, you can use if and else statement to do the conditions. Now, if you're coming from another framework like Angular, in Angular we have a way to do our inline if and logical operators. For example, what you will wrap things into this curly brackets, and then you will pass your condition and these two and symbols, and if this conditions becomes true, then it will render the element. If you take a look at this documentation, we have this if and else condition operator. You can also use this ternary operator of JavaScript. We also have a guide to prevent components from rendering. The guide is self-explanatory, so I don't want to waste time by typing this out into your code. Go through this code and you will know how to prevent components from rendering. Next, we're going to talk about list and keys. List and keys are very commonly used in React, and a list is basically, we've already seen how to render array of elements into our UI. So if you look at the code here, that's where we're using that. So we're using this map function. So let's go back to documentation and quickly take a look at what it says here. So it says, given the code below, we use map function to take an array of numbers and double their values, and we log that to the console. Very self-explanatory, and a map function is pretty much the same thing in React as well as in JavaScript. So you have an array of elements, you can map on them, and then you can render elements within your map function. And we've been using that here as well, so it's very self-explanatory. Now the main concept we will take a look at in this section is going to be keys. Keys help React identify which items have changed or added or removed. So key should be given to element inside an array to give element a stable identity. For example, if you look at this code here we mapping numbers, and then we're also generating keys for that. So here it says key equal to number dot toString. Basically, this is going to help you to write the code, which is going to perform very good, because if you have like 1 million numbers to render and you have one number changed or removed or added later, we will not have to render the whole list again. We will just render what's changed or removed or added, which makes the application perform a lot faster. Before we demonstrate this in our code, we go take a look at some more information here. Here it says key must be unique among siblings. Let's take a look at the code. We got this key that is coming from the index of this map. Now, what if I change the key to, let's say, always to be A? I'll save and then go take a look at our application. refresh the page, and right now there's no component to render, so that's because we need to make this to true. Save, go to application, and refresh. Now all of these headers are being rendered, but if you take a look at our console, I'm going to remove the filtering to errors. Now here it says encoded two children with the same key A. Key should be unique and to that component, maintain their identity cross a bit. So here you clearly telling you if there is any key that is being used for multiple elements. Within this documentation, it tells us that we can embed map in JSX as well. Next, in main concept of React, we have forms, and forms are basic building block of any application. You're gonna have a sign up page, you're gonna have a login page, and you're going to ask a lot of information in your application. So all of that is collected using form. HTML form elements work a bit differently from other DOM elements in React because form elements naturally keep some internal state. You can use plain React forms, but usually when you're building forms and lots of form in your enterprise grade application, you might be using some library. So here's a very famous library called Formic, and it can be used in React. It's going to help you to create forms very easily. So if you are interested in building lots of forms, I suggest to take a look at this Formic docs, create a video on Formic down the road as well. So stay tuned, subscribe to the channel. But in terms of what it tells us here, it's pretty straightforward, and I would highly recommend for you to go through this documentation and you will get an idea how to use forms. And there are multiple differences, for example, handling multiple inputs within the form. At this stage, we have looked at all the concepts in main concept section of React documentation. We got these three sections left to talk about: lifting state up, composition versus inheritance, thinking in React. These are a little bit more advanced concepts, but I'll quickly go through this lifting up state. So oftenly, several components need to reflect on the changing data, and the way we maintain data in React after 16 version or 16 point some version there, we got this hooks. Hooks are basically new entry to React ecosystem. Using hooks, you can do a state pretty nicely compared to the class-based component state management in the past, or some people still uses it. So in the main concept, take a look at this lifting up space if you are going to be using class-based component, which I don't recommend. So we don't want to go through this, but here's a guide for that. Composition versus inheritance. This is a bit of theory behind React, so read through this documentation as well. Here's a list of tips of thinking in React by React documentation. Thinking in React page is all about tips in React, how to make your application perform very well. So it says building a static version in React. We also have this identify the minimum but complete representation of UI state. So lots and lots of information is here. Go through this documentation. This is very important page to how to start thinking in React. Now, we covered all the main concepts. We took a look at how we generated a table using React. We looked at the concepts. We looked at the list and, keys, how to generate components, function-based component and class-based component. We also looked at the state management of this class-based component, and we are going to look at the hooks in the next video of React Crash Course. Now, last concept I would like to point out is fragments. Fragments are very commonly used in React. So for example, if I go ahead and create this div and I'll say hello world and add a comma. All right, if you look at our application, a refresh, it says target container is not a DOM element. So what's going on? We just added a div here. What's going on? So if you look at React documentation of fragments, it says a common pattern in React is for a component to return multiple elements, and fragments lets you group a list of children without adding extra node to the DOM. So if we go and add our React, so let's type react.fragments, and we are going to move this bit down. And let's go to application. I think we forgot the comma there. Add a comma, refresh the page, and you can see now we are rendering the table. We are rendering a button within this component, but we're also rendering this hello world div, which is basically because of this React fragments. Now, there's a short form for that as well. You often come across in React application is by just opening and closing greater than and less than symbol. And same thing can go here as well. Save. And you'll see we're still rendering our application. Now, this short form is specified here as well. So if you go there, here's a short syntax to define the fragments, which I've just shown you, opening and closing brackets, and you can do that as well. So we got some key fragments, and take a look at this. It's very, very simple. So this was the concept that I wanted to show you. It's very important. We also have something called context API. It used to be used a lot. This is you maintain your state of your components, basically class-based component. I don't think it's valid any longer, because if you want to do a state management, you will often use Redux, React, and that's the documentation for that. It requires a separate video how to use Redux to maintain a state. So that's why I will leave that concepts to be covered by Redux instead of this context API. But you're more than welcome to take a look at documentation. Pretty straightforward here as well. We got this guide for code splitting. You can go ahead and then create 10,000 components into one file, which is index.js, but that's not recommended. Let me take you to one more application. Let's open a new window there. And here I'm going to go into the recent, and I'm going to use this benchmark charts application for demonstration purposes. Now, this is basically an application that I used React and TypeScript and React Router for routing. So if I go ahead and then do npm run start, it's going to ask me if I want to use the different port, because React application, the other one which I'm using for the tutorial, it's already using port 3000. So I'll type Y, because we need to use this 3001 port. Now, here's an application which is this home page, right? And a dashboard. A dashboard is built on one of the UI components called Groomy, I think. I'll paste the link for that in the description. So if you look at this here, click on second, it goes to second page, fourth, third, and dashboard. Here we got two tabs there as well. If we click here, it goes back to the main home page. So this involves a router as well, but we're going to take a look at the code structure for this. So if you look at our, let me just zoom in a bit. If you look at our Explorer, we got the source folder. Within that, I created this component folder, configs folder, pages folder, utils folder, and then some of the file which sits outside, which are like app.test.tsx. And then we also have this index.tsx file, which is basically just rendering this one element called app within the browser router. So if you look at pages, here is the file. So we got this dashboard page, home page, no match page, first, fourth, second, and third. So all are returning a function-based component, but to distribute these function-based components into separate files are going to help you to maintain the code, make your code more readable, more organized as well. We got components here, all the components that I will be using, or custom components that will go here We got some assets like main.css file. All the CSS files are going to go into asset/style. It's not really 100% or done. It's just like to show you what can be done within React. So components, pages, routing, and utils, assets, all the folders are created just to organize the code. And this is what it talks about here, code splitting. And then also talking about the bundling your application. So if you take a look at here, this application is bundled using a Webpack. Go to package.json file, and here you will see dev dependencies. Actually not here, but this is actually being built using Webpack. And if you take a look at the guide how to use Webpack with React, you can go through this page as well. Next, we have something called JSX in depth. Now, we've gone through lots of JSX concepts, but this guide will give you a bit more insights into JSX and what's actually possible. So I suggest that you take a look at this guide as well. Optimizing performance. Now, this is going to help you to optimize performance for your application when you're going to build this on for the production platform. So it's very important guide as well. I'm not going through all of this. I'm just talking about the documentation here. And the reason for that is because these concepts require separate videos. And within this basic crash course, we cannot spend time and cover all these concepts. But my reason to talk about them is just to give you a guideline how to go and explore more from this official documentation. I really enjoyed creating this video, and I'm going to create some more videos in React. The reason for that is I'm going to break down this advanced concept into separate videos, and I'm going to organize them into YouTube's playlist, which you can find a link to in the description of this video. So make sure you check that out. Now, before we finish this video, I want to talk about how to go and explore more in React ecosystem and in React API. We've gone through the main concepts. I've shown you what are the advanced concepts that you can go through. And you also have hooks, which will have a separate video, and I put that into the playlist for that. We also have API reference. So not all the things available in React will be available in main concepts, because this is more like a guide than just a reference to the framework. And even in advanced concept, this is again a guide. So if you want to find out what's available into one of the API provided by React, you make sure you go to this API reference section. For example, if you go to this React DOM package, here it will tell you what are the methods available here. Anything possible with this render function will be listed in API reference. I'm going to talk about a React ecosystem. When you talk about React, a lot of times you will hear React is a library or it's a framework. To me, it's actually a library, not a framework, because it doesn't give you everything out of the box, and it doesn't have everything that is required to build enterprise-grade application within the React library. So that is why a community of React has created many different smaller libraries or frameworks around React to help you build application faster. For example, for the forms, I suggest to take a look at the Formic. For state management, I will highly recommend to take a look at React Redux. For designing your UI or making a fancier UI, you can use Material UI, which is very, very popular. Last but not least, we have React Router, which will help you to implement a routing in your React application. And I will definitely create a separate video of React. And I'm also using this React Router in one of my applications as well. For example, here's a routing done through an object instead of JSX element. So it's pretty great. You can also use any JavaScript library with React very, very easily, because at the end of the day, you're going to write JavaScript, right? So these 4 libraries will help you to build enterprise-grade application, because your forms are covered, your state management is covered, your UI is covered, and routing is done as well using React Router. But don't think that this is it for React. We're going to have a lot more videos, a lot more libraries covered down the road. So stay tuned, subscribe to the channel. And if you have any tasks React related, let me know in my business email, which you can find in the description of this video. So I hope you enjoyed this basic crash course. If you have any comments, let me know in the comment section below. And I'll see you guys in the next video of React Adventure. Cheers. Bye.